Ladies and gentlemen, when we speak of the right of asylum, we often imagine political policies, laws, or humanitarian debates. Yet, if we look deeper, through the lens of psychology, we discover that asylum is not merely a political construct, but a profound reflection of the human mind itself. From the earliest myths, humanity has carried within itself the archetype of refuge. The temple in ancient Greece, the church sanctuary in medieval times, even the tribal circle, all these are symbols of the eternal need for safety. To seek asylum is to return, symbolically, to the womb, a place where chaos cannot harm, where the persecuted find protection. This is not just law, it is a universal psychic reality. But there is another side. The asylum seeker often represents the shadow, the outcast, the foreigner, the one who disturbs the order of society. In psychology, the shadow contains what we repress. Likewise, in civilization, asylum seekers mirror those parts of humanity that we would prefer to ignore: suffering, weakness, displacement. To deny them is to deny part of our own nature. To accept them is to integrate the shadow and move toward wholeness. Finally, the collective responsibility. How a society responds to the vulnerable reveals its psychic maturity. A society that welcomes the persecuted shows that it has confronted its own fears and insecurities. A society that rejects them exposes its inner fragmentation and fear of the unknown. Thus, the right of asylum is more than a political debate, it is a mirror. It reveals the deep psychological truth that the human mind itself seeks refuge, integration, and wholeness. And so, when we defend the right of asylum, we are not only protecting others, we are also protecting the sanctuary within ourselves. Now let us go deeper into each of these truths. Throughout human history, the idea of refuge has held a sacred and almost instinctual place in our collective consciousness. It is not a modern invention, nor is it merely the product of political necessity. Rather, it arises from something far older, something deep within the human psyche that transcends cultural boundaries and epochs. We may call this the archetype of refuge, a symbolic image that repeats itself in myth, religion, and social life, embodying the eternal need of human beings to find protection against forces of chaos. At the most primitive level, this yearning for refuge is born in our earliest experience, the womb. The unborn child dwells in complete protection, shielded from danger, nourished without effort, and suspended in a state of wholeness. Every later search for safety carries within it an echo of this primal state. When people seek asylum, whether from persecution, war, or injustice, they are expressing in collective life what each individual psyche unconsciously seeks: a return to the place where survival is secure and chaos is held at bay. This image of safety, of being enveloped by protective walls or divine guardianship, is deeply inscribed in the unconscious and resurfaces in countless forms throughout civilization. Mythology and religious traditions illustrate this archetype with striking clarity. In ancient Greek culture, temples were sanctuaries where even criminals could flee for protection. The altar of a god was not merely stone but symbolized a divine power that suspended the normal order of vengeance. In the Old Testament, the cities of refuge served a similar role, offering safety to those pursued by the law of blood revenge. In the medieval church, the sanctuary of the cathedral became a place where even kings hesitated to intrude, for to violate the sacred space was to invite the wrath of heaven. These traditions are not isolated accidents of history. They are recurring images of the same psychic pattern, the same human instinct, to establish a sacred space that shields the vulnerable from destruction. Psychologically, this impulse reveals something about the structure of the human mind. Just as societies build physical sanctuaries, the psyche itself constructs inner sanctuaries. When overwhelmed by fear, grief, or trauma, the mind retreats into protective symbols, dreams, and inner figures. The maternal archetype often appears in such moments: images of a mother, a cave, a protective goddess, or even a circle of fire that wards off danger. These images are not fantasies in the trivial sense. They are the psyche's natural attempt to restore equilibrium by creating a symbolic refuge. Yet the archetype of refuge is never without its shadow. Every sanctuary risks becoming exclusive, protecting some while excluding others. In mythology, we see this tension clearly. The sacred temple offers protection to those who enter, but often it is closed to outsiders. The city of refuge in ancient Israel protected the innocent manslayer, but not the guilty. The church sanctuary in medieval Europe sometimes sheltered the persecuted, but sometimes served the interests of the powerful. This tension reveals that the archetype of refuge is not merely benevolent. Like all archetypes, it contains light and darkness. It can nurture compassion, but it can also foster division. For the individual psyche, the same danger exists. One may retreat into an inner refuge so completely that one avoids life altogether, becoming trapped in isolation. The protective sanctuary becomes a prison. Likewise, nations that guard their own safety while denying refuge to others expose the darker side of the archetype, the urge to preserve security by projecting danger onto the outsider. The challenge, therefore, is not simply to recognize the need for refuge, but to integrate it wisely, to open the sanctuary without losing its sacred order. From a Jungian perspective, we can say that the archetype of refuge reflects the psyche's longing for wholeness. Just as the self seeks to integrate the many conflicting parts of the personality, so humanity seeks to create spaces where life can continue despite conflict. The right of asylum becomes, in this sense, a collective enactment of individuation. To offer sanctuary is to acknowledge that the vulnerable and the displaced are not alien to us, but part of the same human story. They are, in fact, projections of our own inner need for protection, which no one can escape. Thus, the archetype of refuge reveals both the fragility and the greatness of the human spirit. We are fragile, because we cannot live without protection, but we are great, because we continually create sanctuaries, temples, laws, homes, and acts of compassion that transform the brute struggle for survival into something sacred. In every gesture of offering asylum, we affirm not only the dignity of others but also the deepest truth of our own psyche, that we are beings who cannot live in chaos, who must find meaning, who require a sanctuary not only outside us but also within us. In the end, the archetype of refuge teaches us that asylum is not simply a legal right, nor merely an act of charity. It is the expression of a timeless psychological reality. It is the human mind's remembrance of the womb, the sacred space, the inner sanctuary. To recognize it is to understand something profound about ourselves, that beneath our politics and our institutions, we are driven by the same universal pattern, the longing for safety, belonging, and wholeness. To deny asylum is not merely to reject another, it is to silence one of the deepest symbols that has guided humanity across the centuries. To uphold it, however, is to participate in the unfolding of an archetype that has always been, and will always remain, at the heart of the human journey. When we speak of exile, we tend to imagine it as a political or social misfortune, the painful separation of an individual or a people from their homeland. Yet if we approach it through the lens of depth psychology, we begin to see exile as something that carries a far deeper resonance. To be exiled is not only to be cast out of a physical territory, but also to represent what has been pushed to the margins of the collective psyche. The asylum seeker, the refugee, or the displaced person does not merely stand before us as an external reality. They also stand as symbols of the shadow, those parts of ourselves that we do not wish to recognize. The shadow is a concept central to the psychology of Carl Jung. It is everything within us that we repress, deny, or fear. It is the storehouse of impulses and images that the conscious mind rejects in order to maintain its chosen identity. Yet the shadow is not only individual, it also appears in the life of nations, cultures, and civilizations. What is driven into exile from the social body often mirrors what the individual psyche drives into its unconscious. In both cases, the rejected part does not vanish. It waits, demanding recognition, and returns in disguised forms if ignored. When we look at the phenomenon of asylum seekers, we must recognize this dynamic. Those who arrive at the borders of nations often provoke anxiety, suspicion, or even hostility. They are perceived as intruders, as carriers of chaos, as burdens upon the established order. But psychologically, what we project onto them are precisely the qualities we fear within ourselves. We fear their weakness because we fear acknowledging our own vulnerability. We fear their dependence because we do not wish to confront our own neediness. We fear their difference because it unsettles the fragile order of our own identity. In this sense, the exiled person becomes a living mirror in which the collective sees its own shadow. History provides countless examples of this dynamic. The wandering Jew in medieval Europe was not simply an exiled people, but also a projection of the Christian world's disowned shadow, the aspects of its own religious origins it could not reconcile. In modern times, refugees from wars or political upheavals are often demonized not because of who they are, but because of what they represent: instability, suffering, and a reminder of human fragility. The very act of scapegoating reveals the psychological truth. The group is attempting to push its own darkness onto another, to exile from itself what it cannot accept within. But just as in individual psychology, repression leads not to healing but to distortion, so in collective life, the rejection of the exile deepens division. The shadow denied does not disappear, it returns, often with destructive force. To persecute the exiled is to deny part of our own humanity, and in so doing we create conditions of greater violence, fear, and alienation. The refugee camps on the margins of society are not only physical spaces but psychic symbols. They are the outer representation of what we have banished inwardly, the suffering and vulnerability that remain unresolved. Yet the shadow is not purely negative. Jung reminds us that within the shadow also lie treasures, undiscovered potentials, and sources of renewal. In the same way, the presence of the exile confronts society with a choice. Will we see only the darkness, or will we also recognize the possibility of integration? The stranger who seeks asylum may at first seem to threaten stability, but they may also bring new perspectives, new vitality, and new connections to the larger human story. What appears as disruption may also be the very challenge needed to expand our consciousness. This pattern can be observed in myth. Consider the story of Oedipus. Cast out at birth because of a prophecy, he grows in exile and eventually returns to fulfill his fate. The attempt to deny and expel him did not prevent the prophecy, it made it inevitable. Or take the story of Moses, exiled from Egypt and then returning as the liberator of his people. Again, exile is not simply punishment, it is a crucible, a space in which transformation occurs. These myths remind us that the figure in exile often carries a hidden significance, the bearer of truths that the collective has sought to avoid. In psychological terms, this means that the parts of ourselves that we exile into the unconscious are often the very parts that contain the seeds of growth. The shadow, once faced, enriches the personality with depth, authenticity, and strength. Likewise, a society that dares to face the exile not as a threat but as a mirror may discover a greater wholeness, a greater compassion, and a more profound identity than it had before. To integrate the exile is to integrate the shadow. This does not mean that the process is easy. On the contrary, the shadow always resists recognition. It disturbs, frightens, and unsettles. The presence of the exile forces us to confront realities we would rather ignore: war, poverty, injustice, displacement. Yet it is precisely by facing these realities that we move toward maturity. To deny them is to remain psychologically infantile, clinging to an illusion of purity. To embrace them, however painfully, is to grow into a fuller humanity. Consider the inner life of a person who has never faced their shadow. Such a person appears outwardly stable, but inwardly they are fragile, for their rejected impulses accumulate power and threaten to erupt. Now consider a nation that refuses asylum, that rejects the exile. It may appear secure in the short term, but in truth it becomes haunted, brittle, and prone to violent eruptions. The psyche, whether individual or collective, cannot escape the law of wholeness. What is rejected will return, and only by integration can peace be found. There is, therefore, a moral as well as a psychological imperative in the way we treat those in exile. To grant asylum is not only to protect another human being, it is to acknowledge that the stranger is part of us. It is to admit that our own security rests upon recognizing our vulnerability, that our strength lies not in rejection but in integration. The exile teaches us, if we are willing to learn, that what we banish is never truly foreign. It belongs to the same human soul, the same shared psyche. In this sense, the Right of Asylum reveals a profound psychological truth. The measure of a society's maturity is its capacity to face its shadow. To embrace the exile is to admit that we, too, are exiles in some dimension, cast out from wholeness and seeking a way back. The foreigner at the border is not only a political figure but a symbolic one, carrying within their plight the reflection of our own inner condition. To turn them away is to deepen our own exile from ourselves. To welcome them is to begin the slow work of integration, of healing the split between what we are and what we would rather not see. Thus, exile and shadow are inseparably linked. Every refugee, every displaced person, carries with them not only their personal suffering but also a reminder of the truth that no human being is complete without acknowledging what has been repressed. They stand at the threshold of the collective psyche, demanding recognition. And our response, whether rejection or acceptance, reveals not only our political stance but our psychic state. For in the end, the shadow waits for us all. We can exile it, deny it, and project it onto others, or we can turn toward it and discover within its darkness the hidden path to wholeness. When we examine the Right of Asylum through the lens of psychology, it becomes clear that the way a society responds to those who seek refuge is not simply a political matter but a profound revelation of its collective psyche. Just as the individual is tested by how he treats his weakest impulses and most vulnerable emotions, so too is a society tested by how it treats the vulnerable who come to its gates. In this sense, asylum becomes a mirror of collective responsibility, showing whether a culture has reached maturity in its inner life or whether it still clings to primitive fears and instincts. Responsibility at the collective level is not an abstraction. It arises from the fact that human beings share a common psychic ground. Jung spoke often of the collective unconscious, the deep layer of the psyche that unites all people through archetypal patterns and images. If this is true, then those who seek asylum are not strangers in any ultimate sense. They are the embodiments of our own shared unconscious life, the living expressions of the same archetypal dramas that unfold within us all. To deny them is, in effect, to deny part of ourselves. To receive them is to acknowledge that humanity is bound together by a deeper unity than nationality, language, or custom. When a nation closes its doors to asylum seekers, it does so often under the banner of self-protection. The rhetoric speaks of security, of preserving culture, of defending resources. Yet beneath these rationalizations lies a more profound psychological truth. The collective ego fears being overwhelmed by what it does not understand. Just as an individual ego resists the incursion of unconscious material, fearing that it will lose control, so too does a collective resist the presence of those who carry with them unfamiliar customs, languages, and histories. In truth, however, it is not the foreigner that threatens the collective identity but the collective's own rigidity, its refusal to grow and adapt. The psyche, whether personal or communal, stagnates when it resists expansion. To welcome the asylum seeker is to enact an archetypal movement of integration. The collective, like the individual, becomes whole not by excluding what is foreign but by confronting it, embracing it, and finding a place for it within the larger pattern of life. This does not mean that the process is without difficulty. Integration always brings conflict, discomfort, and the need for transformation. Yet it is precisely through such challenges that growth occurs. A society that accepts responsibility for the vulnerable is a society willing to undergo transformation, to let its rigid boundaries soften and to recognize itself in the stranger. We see this truth reflected in myth and history. The ancient Greeks told the story of Zeus Xenios, the god who protected strangers and wanderers. To violate the sacred duty of hospitality was to offend the divine itself. In the biblical tradition, the command to care for the stranger is repeated as a central moral law, for the people of Israel knew themselves what it was to live in exile. In both traditions, hospitality and refuge are not optional acts of kindness but essential obligations that reveal the moral and spiritual health of a community. They show that collective responsibility is not merely a political convenience but a fundamental archetypal demand. The refusal of responsibility, on the other hand, carries grave consequences. A society that denies sanctuary reveals that it is caught in the grip of fear, unable to look beyond its own narrow interests. Such a society projects its anxieties outward, demonizing the asylum seeker as a threat. But in doing so it only multiplies its own divisions, for the psyche cannot escape its own truth. The suffering it refuses to acknowledge at its borders will return within, in the form of social unrest, spiritual emptiness, or hidden guilt. Nations, like individuals, suffer neuroses when they repress their responsibilities, and these neuroses manifest in aggression, anxiety, and disintegration. Responsibility, therefore, is not merely ethical but psychological. It is the recognition that the suffering of others is bound to our own wholeness. In the collective unconscious, there is no absolute boundary between self and other. The refugee is not out there, but within the shared psychic reality we all inhabit. To respond with compassion is to align ourselves with the archetype of care, to take part in the eternal pattern of healing and protection that has guided humanity throughout the ages. To refuse is to harden the ego, to retreat into illusion, and to cut ourselves off from the sources of renewal that the unconscious offers. It is also worth noting that collective responsibility requires courage. Just as an individual must face the shadow to achieve wholeness, a society must face the discomfort of integration. There will always be tension, conflict, and fear when strangers enter the community. But to accept responsibility means to hold this tension, to endure the discomfort without collapsing into rejection. Jung emphasized that true growth requires the capacity to hold opposites in creative tension until a new form emerges. The presence of the asylum seeker brings precisely such an opposition, the known and the unknown, the familiar and the foreign, the secure and the vulnerable. To deny this tension is to stagnate. To bear it is to grow. In this way, the right of asylum reveals itself as a psychological drama of the collective. It shows us whether we are capable of transcending narrow tribal instincts and recognizing our shared humanity. It asks whether we can respond not merely from fear but from a deeper sense of unity. The societies that rise to this challenge are those that evolve in richness, wisdom, and compassion. The societies that fail remain locked in cycles of projection and hostility. Collective responsibility is, in the end, a reflection of individuation on a grand scale. Just as the individual moves toward wholeness by integrating the unconscious, so too does humanity move toward wholeness by acknowledging its responsibility for the vulnerable, the exiled, and the displaced. Each act of refuge, each gesture of asylum, is therefore more than an act of charity. It is a step in the individuation of the human race. It is the psyche of humanity itself moving toward greater wholeness. If we look closely, we see that the asylum seeker brings not only a plea for safety but also a hidden gift. They bring us the opportunity to see ourselves, to measure our collective maturity, to ask whether we are willing to embrace the stranger within and without. This gift is difficult, for it demands transformation. But without it, humanity remains fragmented, caught in fear and denial. With it, we move closer to the realization of our deepest archetypal truth, that we are one human family, bound together not only by necessity but by the profound unity of the psyche itself. Thus the right of asylum is not simply a law on a page. It is a living symbol of collective responsibility. It shows whether a society has the courage to grow, to face its fears, and to embrace its wholeness. In every decision to grant or deny refuge, we glimpse not only political motives but the state of the human soul. And in this light, the way we treat the most vulnerable among us becomes the most accurate measure of who we truly are. When we look deeply at the right of asylum, we discover that it is not merely a political policy or a matter of legal procedure. It is, in truth, a reflection of our own inner life. The yearning for refuge echoes the deepest archetypes of the human psyche, the longing for safety, the confrontation with the shadow, and the challenge of collective responsibility. Every asylum seeker who comes before us is not only a human being in need but also a mirror, revealing how far we ourselves have come in the path of psychological and spiritual maturity. If we choose rejection, we reinforce division, deny our own vulnerability, and exile parts of our collective soul. But if we choose compassion, we participate in something far greater. We affirm the timeless human quest for wholeness. We acknowledge that the stranger is not alien but kin, that in protecting the persecuted we are also protecting the sanctuary within ourselves. The right of asylum is therefore not just a gift we extend to others, it is a gift we extend to our own humanity. It is an act that binds us to the deepest truths of the psyche, that we cannot survive in isolation, that we cannot flourish in denial, and that our greatest strength lies in integration and unity. Let us remember, then, that in every act of offering refuge, we are not only saving lives, we are also affirming the very essence of what it means to be human. Thank you.